So indeed, I'm going to do this in two segments because I have some rather misbehaving children that want to stop me at what I'm doing. Well, indeed, we live in dangerous times. We were at once not so distant in our past, praised worldwide as a city on a shining hill. That statement alone was not self-serving, but globally acknowledged for how it was that America was not just the empire of the world, but it was so but why it was so. Many people make statements about what this reason might be and often reference to democracy as the emblematic quality that distinguishes us from the rest of the world. Democracy is not at all the single greatest quality our nation employs in the face of other nations unilaterally. In fact, democracy is universally understood to be used in some manner, even in the most extreme ideologies. In communism, for example, democracy is a necessary component for the operational construct as a function of its Politburo or organizational power structure. It isn't that they are not democratic, and it's merely a matter of who and what and how the power is exercised. In the case of absolute dictatorships, of course, they generally no such organizational hierarchy left in place that might usurp its constraints on power. But once again, if this is the case, even autocratic dictatorships do not rule from a vacuum. Whatever you might well call them, elites, oligarchy, transnational corporate combines of this or that, democracy is all the same on some level being exercised. One might argue that this definition is entirely too wide to conclude theocratic, autocratic, and fascist regimes employ democracy, but that is precisely the reason we must argue that they in fact are. They ideologically are core democratic. Democracy is not just about who is allowed to vote, but simply that the process by which it occurs is only that the majority wins. The point to all of this should not at all be lost on your understanding. It should be no question that democracy, however limited it is a no-brainer. The statement, city on a shining hill, is not a reference to democracy or even that our democracy is respectively representative in its form. The danger in interpreting the advantageous reward over America is somehow intrinsically connected to our representative democratic government is as much as an unhealthy, pernicious, corrupting belief as it is an ideological, destructive malignancy. The distinction between America and the rest of the world was and always has been our republic. The republic is simply the Constitution, one piece of paper, and the absolute first 10 amendments or freedoms that apply to all citizens. Nothing at all about representative government in the first 10 amendments. For far too long, this country has been at all once the beneficiary and the victim of a constitutional republic. America would not be here as the greatest power on earth had it not arranged a constitutional republic with universal democratic representative government. Now that we can be sure of what it is that makes America distinct and wholly above and beyond other nations, I would ask you to look at your country, the government, the politicians, the abject, wanton, willful corruption, lawlessness we have become. It is any wonder that half the country, nearly 50%, democratically voted to put a murderer, treasonous criminal into the Oval Office. You might take issue with that or any at all words, but if they are at all true, and we can prove that they are, your argument for democracy, or as our great and noble difference from the rest of the world, is laid bare for all who can see it for what it is. Many of the Democratic ideologues are the first to argue this election is a fraud. What happened to the democratic freedom-loving Americans? Do they even exist? Because half the country cannot accept the democratically elected president, they aspire to evoke violence, disorder, and ad hominem attacks, portraying themselves as victims, all the while pursuing any avenue of hostility and violence. Unfortunately for all of us living in this present age are being confronted by the inauspicious double-edged sword called a constitutional republic. Power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. Your oh so cherished isn't quite so magnanimous after all. Now, rather than settle down and accept the will of the majority, the left-wing lunatics would have you believe that our democracy has been hijacked and are making it abundantly clear that our democratic process has been undermined. By who exactly is this democracy being undermined? Is it the work of a foreign power seeking to curry favor with the party in power? No, the noxious malfeasance is being spread through the Fourth Estate. The poisonous, corrupt media has become the single most pernicious weapon being used as massive mind manipulation against an inadequate, mentally ill, pathetic public. The sole purpose of a never-ending state of enmity and aggressiveness. The Democratic Party, along with the leftist Marxist media, are working around the clock to create antagonism and foment opposition that has now become so prioritized that the nation is utterly on the brink of open conflict. The sad irony of all of this is that it is not because of democracy have we become so lost, but rather it is the republic that enables this constant barrage of propaganda and disinformation. The left continue to say our democracy is under threat. They are correct, but by whom? The democracy has already been lost about 30 years ago. All you have to do is look at the leaders of the Legislative Congress and see who among them over the last 30 years has left or is still there. They are the corruptive influence. They are the pursuit of trying to undo democratic election, all the while saying our democracy is threatened. They are the ones threatening it. The republic allows them to add fuel to the imaginary fire. If only we could silence them to stop them from inciting violence and hatred for all things that threaten their grasp for power, the only thing that they really do want. Look at what we have, the double-edged sword of a republic. The irony should not be lost on anyone with a brain that can manage to still think for itself. The very authors of protected our democracy are the same ones who have exploited it for 30 years, and now they are afraid they will lose it. If we manage to hold tight and now, for once in our lives, use the process again in 2018 in the midterms and vote out the leadership of both parties, and we just might restore our democracy. From this vantage, the republic is under such lethal threat that if this civil unrest continues to deteriorate the operating functions of the federal government, we could see ourselves in something far more impractical than the Great Depression. The Great Depression did not continue in a downward spiral because the citizens were incapable of withstanding the hard times as a nation. They did so as a nation and sought to use the federal government and all its active components for a common good. The Great Depression lasted no longer than 8 years, and the people were unified behind the administration and understood Roosevelt had their best interests at heart and worked effectively to bring about as much assistance as his position could manage. And we did not pull through the air, and we did pull through the air even stronger than before. Today, we have a very different dichotomy occurring. Huge populations of the citizens are actively subverting the levers of power in a way that is not only divisive, but worse yet, the idea of civil unrest being promulgated to the mass media corporate conglomerates that do not report events. They actively propagandize and editorialize almost everything or anything that the current administration is attempting to implement. The healthcare fiasco is beyond a lethal problem, but I really fear it is going to devastate our tenuous, fragile economic growth, no matter if it is the Affordable Care Act or the Trump Care Act. Either way, it is erroneous. As intelligent minds, we should collectively rise up to scrap healthcare as a feasible subsidy entirely, and for the least foreseeable future, just put it on hold. The system we have currently is not great, but it is and has run with little resistance for nearly 30 years. We are talking about 21 million citizens that would have access to coverage, but that number is completely low from 20 years ago. Out of 380 million citizens, 20 million will have to use the current system as it has been done for all along. This does not mean that these people will not get treated for illnesses. Understand, citizens, aliens, immigrants, anyone at all in this country cannot be turned away from any hospital if they show up and they are in need of medical attention. Why the need to have the holy transfer of wealth from the middle class to the executive class so quickly? I just do not find the urgency of inserting a massively over-involved into something that will no longer be returning anything for its implementation. We need jobs and infrastructure. The government could and should focus on these things first, of course, cutting the massively overly leveraged VAT tax from 30% to 15% like Mexico and China. This alone is only what might provide a platform for positive GDP growth over the next 4 years. The real question on all of this is, of course, the Fed. At 0% interest rates for 8 years and massive amounts of QE, the currency is being annihilated. Every year they have to do another QE. This is madness. But if the Fed does not move the rate to at least 4% and really soon, we might as well throw up our hands and give up this going to be beyond hyperinflation, and the Great Depression is a picnic compared to what the currency annihilated into worthlessness. This is nothing new to our empires and nation states that did exactly what we have been doing for 8 years, thinking we can get away with it for what, another 2 years if we're lucky? I really do not see the economic reality changing because no one can tell the Fed to move the rate by law. They have to make that call. Janet Yellen, the current Fed chair, has told us for 1.5 years every quarter when they meet, she says rate hike, rate hike. Why? For 1.5 years, but no rate hike. Why? Because anyone understands economics knows that if the woman says rate hike, it means she is confident the economy at large can withstand the crippling effects of a rate hike, such as when they do it, the economy does not overheat to the point of hyperinflation. Inflation is a no-brainer. That's just part of the deal. Rate hikes always involve overheating of the economy, even if it's at 1%. And they would for 4 months and do another 1% and so on, until they get up to at least 4%. The woman tells us that rate hike, but never actually does it. After 1.5 years, it could only be that our economy is in such a catastrophic condition that even 50 basis points, 0.5%, would likely cause the larger economy to overheat so much that it could very well collapse altogether. The Fed painted themselves into a box in 2008 with the bailouts. Bernanke did the bailouts, okay, not great, but the circumstances were quite dire, and I can understand this was the only real solution. However, in 2008, the rate was 5.5%, a pretty healthy rate. Well, after the bailout money was distributed and the banks started functioning again, he immediately lowers the 5.5% rate to 0% in 1 day. This is unbelievably insane. He knows that this is the absolute wrong thing to do under the circumstances, but the rationale behind the move is quite easy. The U.S. is the largest GDP in the world, and all the major stock exchanges are located in New York City, etc. But the next largest GDP is China, and they are 3 times smaller than us. The reason Bernanke makes the rate reduction is based on the premise that because we are the biggest GDP in the world and we can move the rate to 0, this allows the Fed to print massive amounts of QE injections into the larger economy, and that 0% we may very well have at least 7 to 8 years to get away with it before we would need to move it up again. The fundamental problem with this is that at the massive QE over the last 8 years will eventually have to come back to the Fed at 0% interest rates. That amount of money is a brick in the face, and we will fall down and not get back up. If they would move it now, no matter how much overheating the economy it might entail, it's not the point. We have got to raise the rate to at least 4% soon. It's like a pillow in our face when the dollars come back. We will not fall down, but slightly unbalanced. Well, the Fed is not a part of the federal government. Not even 3 months they met in secret, and we wait for Yellen to tell us what they are going to do. I studied economics, and all I can say is that this woman will not even move the rate 50 basis points. The reality of this economy is far worse than any one of us can imagine. They are not stupid. They understand this rate is the single most important element of the health and the well-being of our economy, and I believe, just from my observation, they are going to allow the economy to fully melt. It's not a stock market crash, it's a currency crisis. They understand that they cannot continue QE printing for the next 2 years without massive economic calamity. It looks pretty clear to me that Yellen is going to allow the economy to implode, and the possibility of the IMF or the World Bank coming in to liquefy the equity markets may actually be what they're thinking. I really cannot be sure if the IMF even has enough liquid to pump into the U.S. economy as the lender of last resort. These banks are secretive and no one has the oversight on them. They operate independent of the national interest. Besides, they are private equity on loans to the government. It's operating capital and interest. The reason the situation is far worse than 2008 is because the difficulty is not paying the principal. They don't care about that. We, the U.S. government, cannot even service the interest on the debt. That's the main problem. Stay tuned for part